Welcome to the new Food of Love, which is an audio-visual version of the essay series on music, musicians, and culture, which I recently began publishing on Substack. If you want to catch new rants and ravings as early as possible, you can subscribe for free at Food of Love with a 0 instead of an O. .substack.com. The link is downstairs in the description. You can also do all the YouTubey things to this video to help support the growth of this channel. Liking it, subscribing to the channel, and especially sharing it with friends will help tremendously. Thanks! I'm recording this in the middle of a winter storm, so if you hear a bunch of oversized trucks and SUVs making a bunch of noise outside my window, trust me, I also hear them. Support mixed-use walkable neighborhood. I'm coming up on day 100 of a music discovery challenge. It originally came in the form of a book, which if you're like me, you've seen mentioned time and time again in Wikipedia deep dives through classic albums. Originally published in 2005, 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die might have the most high-stakes title of any coffee table book. As a music listener, it makes you think about your own mortality and the thousands of great albums you might never hear. It takes the well-trodden territory of the top number adjectivist albums of all time list formula, and it raises the stakes to that of your own demise. I've definitely thought a lot about how much music I'll miss, despite having listened to as much as I possibly can over the past 15 or so years of my life, and planning to continue that practice until I physically can't anymore. One problem I have with most greatest albums ever compendiums is that inevitably a lot of good stuff has to be left on the cutting room floor. The art of the album as we think of it today has its origin in the LP era, when artists began to treat their 12-inch vinyl releases as a series of songs, tracks, or pieces that have some sort of connective tissue, typically in their music, themes, and/or concept. Frank Sinatra gets most of the credit for inventing the concept album with In the Wee Small Hours in 1955, which is where 1001 Albums starts. It's as good a place to start as any other, especially if you need to cram 1001 albums in there. Unfortunately, this means that a lot of great pre-1955 recordings, mainly in the domain of jazz and classical music, are not represented in this book. In fact, while jazz maintains a somewhat healthy presence in the list of records presented by 1001 Albums, there are no classical recordings at all. The absence of an album like Steve Reich's 1978 ECM recording of Music for 18 Musicians, one of the most influential albums in contemporary classical, rock, and electronic music, seems to me like a pretty huge oversight. Plus, there's some of the most definitive recordings of a wide range of incredible repertoire in the classical tradition, both old and new, that have been and continue to be released over the years. 1001 Albums also omits soundtracks, Broadway cast recordings, and greatest hits compilations. If you want those, and some classical recordings, you'll need to find Tom Moon's similarly named 1000 recordings to hear before you die. Books are weird. This isn't to say I don't appreciate the magnitude of what general editor Robert Dimery and the 90-plus music writers who contributed to 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die achieved. We're talking about a series of 1001 reviews of what these writers believe to be some of the best, most historically significant studio albums, and a few live ones too, ever released. It averages out to over 10 albums per writer if you crunch the numbers, I think. If you listen to one album from this book per day, it would take around 2 years and 8 months. Statistically, there's bound to be at least a few great records in there. The chronological presentation of all the albums presented is something that truly sets this apart from other lists of its kind, which often default to a ranked, numbered structure that gets people talking about which albums they felt were placed too high or low. Think Rolling Stone, think Apple Music. Since 1001 Albums is a coffee table book and doesn't need to concern itself with engagement bait monetization tactics, its structure lends itself to being casually flipped through. Ideally, you turn to a random page, put your finger on an album, and in this day and age, pull it up on your preferred streamer. I can't imagine doing this challenge in the CD era. There's even a website that will go through the process of choosing albums for you. 1001 Albums Generator, which I'll shorten to 1001 AG going forward, was created by Swedish software developer Alexander Nilsson, who developed the site as a music discovery tool with the express purpose of breaking people out of their algorithmically curated music tastes and getting them to engage with a wider spectrum of musical styles and music history. It uses the entire library of albums published in every edition of 1001 Albums, so the final count is a little higher at 1089. It's a valiant effort, and it's incredible that a book like 1001 Albums could facilitate such a useful tool. Nilsson was recently interviewed in Exclaim if you want to learn more. Given that I'm around 100 days into my own 1001 AG journey, I can say that so far it's been a very fun exercise in 1, expanding my musical horizons, and 2, revisiting records that have had great significance in my life. I've been obsessed with the album as an art form since I was a teenager, and while I didn't count the number of albums on this list that I've already listened to, I've had quite a few run-ins with old favorites, and I've occasionally been assigned albums I had already listened to that week outside of this challenge. I've also had records that were new listens for me at the time, but are quickly entering into my own list of all-time favorites. But alas, there's another issue I have with all the greatest albums lists everyone talks about, even one as useful as this: bias. It's an inevitable fact of life that writers will write what they know. 1001 Albums is a book written in the English language, and the majority of the 90+ music writers who contributed to it are from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Ireland. Thus, English language music acts from the United States, especially the United Kingdom and Ireland, dominate the list. There's also a few Australians in the mix too. There's a decent number of international or foreign language releases, but even a lot of those fall in line with what you tend to expect from a greatest albums of all time list. Namely, there's a lot of rock music on this list. Like, a lot. Granted, it was the most popular genre in the Anglosphere for decades. It's still pretty damn popular, but as we'll come to see, a lot of the canonized albums in rock history don't particularly move me. Videos in this series won't focus on every album I listen to for this challenge, and they might not all be this long. There's some stone cold classic albums on this list that have generated a lot of conversation over time, and I often find myself unable to contribute much of anything new to that conversation. Instead, my coverage will be focused mainly on albums which I had a particularly strong response to. It could be positive, negative, or somewhere in between. Essentially, I'll be whittling this down to the albums I found the most interesting to listen to in the context of a challenge like this. I'll also occasionally refer to the reviews in my edition of 1001 Albums, which is the 2008 version, as a way of demonstrating how these albums are being presented to readers. For the full list of albums I've listened to for this challenge, you'll have to venture over to Rate Your Music, where I'll do little first impression blurbs that kind of morph into some of these more thought out pieces. On day 4 of this challenge, I was treated to a live in studio recording by Fela Kuti and the Africa 70, featuring drummer Ginger Baker of Cream and Blind Faith fame. Kuti is one of Nigeria's and the African continent's most important musical and political figures of the past century, celebrated for his role in combining traditional Nigerian and West African music traditions with American and European rock and funk sounds. Recorded at Abbey Road in 1971 and released the same year, this album, simply titled Live, played a huge role in exposing Kuti's art to an international audience, in large part due to Baker's presence on the album and its artwork. The essay on this record in 1001 Albums, written by Scottish author David Hudgen, generally does a good job summarizing the events that led to Kuti's rise to global prominence, but it actually gets some details about this album wrong. Kuti is referred to on this album as taking a piano solo and moving to saxophone later on, but he actually plays an organ here. Not the worst mistake, but, you know, I'm into details. And he didn't start playing saxophone in his band until a few years after the release of Live. Baker also doesn't join the band until side B, even though Hudgen claims Baker's on the opening track, Let's Start. You can hear Kuti announce Ginger Baker taking the stage on track 3, so I'm not sure how that got mixed up. I hope other artists from outside the Anglosphere who appear in this list get a little more attention to detail in their write-ups going forward. So while Baker's presence, as I said, looms large over this album, especially on its cover, let's not pull any punches. The most important drummer on this album is the Africa 70's own Tony Allen. His drumming embodies all the finest parts of a myriad of traditions from Nigeria, America, England, elsewhere, and it sets the rest of the band up for great success on both sides of this thrilling session, both with and without Ginger Baker. Fela Kuti's songs and Tony Allen's drums pretty much are the sound of Afrobeat to me at this point. And that's no disrespect to Baker, who does remarkably well in this musical mixture. Baker was well known for being kind of an asshole, but he definitely doesn't play like one here, injecting just the right amount of vitality into the tracks that feature him without stomping on Allen's or anyone else's toes. I mean, two drummers playing together is no easy feat. It's much harder than it looks. Part of what draws me so strongly to the few Afrobeat albums that I've listened to so far is the presence of so many different engaging layers of rhythm, especially compared to Western funk music, which I find, despite its superficial similarities to Afrobeat, is much more minimal in comparison. On this album, even with 2 drummers, a sizable percussion section, rhythm guitar, horns, keys, bass lines, all piled on top of each other, there's a precision at play in every moment that's difficult to ignore. Yeah, this is basically a jam session recording where a band plays 4 chords for around 8 to 13 minutes each, which I imagine is some listeners' idea of hell. But if that's you, I would implore you, turn your attention away from the pitch content and towards some of the most infectious grooves you're ever likely to hear before you die. The day after listening to Live, my 1001 AG profile assigned me 1970s Layla and other assorted love songs, the Soul studio album by Derek and the Dominoes, a short-lived band formed by Baker's fellow ex-member of Cream and current racist buffoon Eric Clapton. 5 days in, and I'd been assigned 2 albums with ex-members of Cream on back-to-back days. I thought about going out to buy a lottery ticket right then and there.